If you love to be remembered as the person who gives the best birthday gifts, I'm here to tell you that 1-800-Flowers.com is your ultimate birthday gifting destination. 1-800-Flowers has thoughtful and artfully created options that are guaranteed to deliver the best birthday surprise. Shop thousands of unique gifts at 1-800-Flowers.com for exclusive offers and great values. To order today, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/tune-in. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/tune-in.
Bolt your doors, lock your windows, turn off your lights, and come with me into the Weird Darkness. I'm Darren Marlar, the host of Weird Darkness, where I bring you true tales of the paranormal, supernatural, legends, lore, the strange and bizarre, mysterious, macabre, unsolved, and unexplained. Episodes posted 7 days a week. Listen to Weird Darkness in the Spreaker podcast player app, and you can also comment on individual episodes, and I can respond to those comments. Look for Weird Darkness on the Spreaker podcast player app.
Hello, 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 guys. It is that time of week again. We are back with another episode of What's Up, Doc, the true crime documentary podcast. I am your host, Gemma Delaney, and I'm here to tell you what is up with the latest, newest, hottest true crime documentary releases. As always, if you want to follow us, we are on social media. We are at What's Up Doc Podcast. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and newly on TikTok as well. I'm down with the kids. See, I'm hip to the happening beat. Yeah, we're sporadically on TikTok. Give it time. This week is unprecedented for What's Up Doc. So in almost 3 years of recording, I've never released 2 episodes week on week. I've always been bi-weekly. And I've also never done a comparison episode. So we're covering 2 episodes, you might have guessed that by the title, covering 2 documentaries in this episode of What's Up Doc. And I am delighted. I'm so fucking ecstatic to be joined today, co-hosting the one and only Sinead from Mens Rea Podcast. How are you?
I am excellent. How are you?
I'm so good. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to talk about not one but 2 documentaries. In a first,
2 big ones.
2 big ones. In a first ever for What's Up Doc, I've never released 2 episodes back to back, week on week. I've always been a bi-weekly podcast, and secondly, I've never covered 2 documentaries in the one episode as well. But just for the listeners, myself and Sinead, I pitched initially to you that we would do an analysis of the Netflix version of events, shall we say, which is Sophie, a Murder in West Cork. And that was released a week ago yesterday on Netflix. But then 3 days before that, there had been the release of the Jim Sheridan version, Murder at the Cottage, and that was released on Sky Crime. And in the production meeting, myself and Sinead got talking about it, and I was like, look, have you watched that one as well? And she was like, I have. And then I was like,
of course I have.
Of course I know.
Twice.
But like, I don't, it's a lot of work to put on someone though, because like instead of 3-hour-long episodes, you know, it's then the task of analyzing 8-hour-long episodes. And I know I love doing that, but you know, I don't suppose that everyone has as little to do with free time as I do.
If it was any other case, you might have had to convince me, but this one is so fascinating that I couldn't stop myself from watching Jim Sheridan's documentary and from them watching the Netflix documentary and then watching them again and again.
Yeah.
And again.
Yeah, so, same as. And I thought that was so funny. We met for the thing and you were like, oh yeah, I've already watched the 2 of them a couple of times. And I was like, me too. It's not just me. And like we said, really, I mean, it's for anybody outside of Ireland or France, I guess this might not be as prolific a case, but certainly for Ireland and France, the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier, which is the subject of both of these true crime documentaries, is is it too big a statement to say it's our most famous unsolved in inverted commas murder?
Possibly, yeah. It's up there at least.
It definitely is. It's probably like the equivalent of our, Black Dahlia, or maybe more accurately the O.J. Simpson trial, in which that, there seems to be ample evidence to convict, but yet a conviction couldn't be got. And it's an absolutely prolific case over here, and it's a case I was reared on, and I'm sure you've grown up listening to as well.
Yeah,
we'll motor through the boring stuff first, Sinead. So obviously we're doing two. So we're doing Murder at the Cottage, which is the Jim Sheridan one, and that's the one on Sky Crime. And then we're doing Sophie, a Murder in West Cork. That's directed by John Dower, and that obviously is the Netflix version of events. Jim Sheridan, look, he's an award-winning director. He's an Oscar-winning director of, In the Name of the Father, Into the West, to name a few. My Left Foot, like so many quintessentially Irish films. John Dower then, on my part anyway, lesser known, I hadn't heard of him before, gave him an old Google, and he's actually directed a documentary which I've seen before and loved, I Don't Like Mondays.
Yeah, I saw that one too.
Yeah, that's a cracker.
Yeah.
And he also did a stint on Banged Up Abroad, the series, which I've also seen.
Who hasn't watched that? Yeah.
I loved that series, actually.
So I will never go to Thailand.
Never go to Thailand, exactly, yeah. Or like, don't offer to be a drugs mule for money. It's never if he says it's only over the border, it's not. If he says it's easy, it's not. But so they're the two things that he's probably best known for. In terms of an intended audience, like what do you think the intended audience is here, Sinead?
I think, it's aimed at the kind of true crime fans, but I think kind of anyone with an interest in true crime. Basically, the Netflix one is very much kind of for the masses. It's a good introduction to the case. It's, for mystery lovers, whodunit lovers, crime lovers, all of that kind of thing, people who have an interest in Ireland as well. I think the Jim Sheridan one is perhaps more focused on Irish and UK people.
Definitely, yeah.
Maybe, it's kind of for a smaller subset of people. But they're both kind of generally aimed at anybody who likes true crime, which is pretty much everybody these days. So they're for mass consumption.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that. I mean, it seems a stupid question, but you'd heard about this subject before, obviously.
I had. So the murder of Sophie took place in December of 1996. And that was the year that myself and my parents moved home from the States. So I wasn't super aware of what was going on in the true crime world at that time. I was 10 or 11. But definitely, as Ian Bailey, the main suspect in the case, started bringing court cases against the papers for libel, and then the Irish state and the guards for being effectively what he alleged to be stitched up in the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier. My awareness of it grew, and it's kind of always been there. The case has been kind of unresolved for 25 years. So it's something I'd say people of our generation have kind of grown up with.
100%, yeah.
And it was one of those cases that interested me so much that it's one of the very early episodes in my podcast. I kind of pick and choose topics that I want to know more about. And so the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier was one of the first ones that I wanted to jump in and have a look at. But that was, 4 years ago now at this stage. So the documentaries were quite timely. It was a good kind of refresher for me on what happened and what the various kind of evidence and the various sides of stories that you hear. It was a good refresher for me on that.
Yeah, and like you're absolutely right there. That's sides is probably the very ample word there. There's two very different stories, I think, in both these documentaries, although obviously the subject matter is the same. There's two very different ways of handling the cases, I think. But look, I mean, for anybody who doesn't know this case, and like I said, that would be a lot of people, I would assume, outside of Ireland and outside of France as well. The murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier took place in 1996 in West Cork. And obviously there was the famous podcast of the same title. It took place just outside the town of Skull, in a townsland of Skull. And it took place on the 23rd of December. So like just right before Christmas. Sophie had a holiday home in the wilds of West Cork that she frequented off season, and she was over, as we learn in one of the documentaries, to fix the heating. The heating had broken down, and her family hoped to holiday in Ireland in the new year, and so she went across to get that sorted, kind of ahead of them coming over, with the plan being to get back home to France for Christmas, to spend that with her 15-year-old son. She had separated from his father, but had remarried. And so her son was with his father, and then her own husband as well was back in France as well. She had an interesting couple of days leading up to her murder, which we'll get into later on in the podcast. But some, I mean, strange happenings, definitely. And she expressed to a local that she felt something bad was going to happen, or she felt, there was an ominous feeling. And this was just the day before her murder. She was found murdered by her neighbor. So she lived up kind of a quite rural laneway, but there was another little house further up the lane to hers. And as they left to go get their groceries the next morning at approximately 10 a.m., they stumbled across Sophie's battered, bloody, unrecognizable body. She had ran from her house, or fled from her house, it would seem, in her night clothes. She did have boots on, which I guess raised some questions. It seemed like at least she knew she was going outside. She had time to put them on. And she was caught on barbed wire. And like I said, she was beaten nearly beyond recognition, which is just horrific in and of itself. She was bet with a rock and then with a breeze block or a cement block. And have I left anything out? Have I covered all the?
No, that's
the important things.
That's basically it. Yeah, she was found early that Saturday. I believe it was a Saturday morning just before Christmas. So yeah, very sad and really gruesome and horrific. I think one thing that we see in the documentaries are some crime scene photos. Nothing terribly graphic.
Nothing terribly graphic. No, you're dead right. Yeah, there's nothing. I didn't see anything of the actual body. It was more, it seemed to be once the body had been taken away, it was like the blood spatter pattern and, the blood on the stone and on the brick and the gate. But I don't recall seeing any pictures of her actual body, covered or uncovered. But
they really give, just the sheer amount of blood present on the scene gives an indication of exactly how ferocious the attack on her was, which is just, it's just really terribly sad. Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was interesting that both of the documentaries started at the same point of the story, but took a different angle. So what I mean by that is both documentaries start with the hook, and obviously the hook being the murder. With Jim Sheridan's one, he starts initially, I thought anyway, he kind of places himself into the story, which I didn't necessarily agree with, or like it, like the first statement in the Jim Sheridan one is like, Jim Sheridan is a however many times Oscar winning director. He's always been fascinated with this case. I mean, the feminist in me, the roaring feminist in me is always going to go, Jim. Yeah.
Go have a good hard shite for yourself. Like, there was no need to put that in. What's that got to do with anything? And it's just very much that whole, you know, I'm the man and I'm going to tell you the story of this poor little woman. And I didn't like that. And that actually initially got my back up. But I love true crime and I persisted, and I'm glad I did, because I actually ended up really enjoying the documentary. But I mean, I think that was maybe ill-advised on, you know, I'm sure he has people around him, and I know probably the people around him are unlikely to tell Jim Sheridan what to do. But, you know, you have to advise somebody when something is ill-advised. And I do think in this day and age, that could have got a lot of backlash, a lot of negative backlash.
It's kind of the choice between centering himself in the story and centering Sophie in the story. Yeah. And I think these days,
whose story is it like?
True crime really is trying really hard, especially the indie podcasters that I would float around on the internet with. Yeah. Try really hard to make sure that the victim is present in the story and is the focus of the story, rather than the person who committed it, which is usually where we end up. But in this case, we have Jim Sheridan centered alongside a very kind of wonky reenactment of like a fleeing woman in a darkened, and you know, that put me off as well. I hate seeing reenactments in true crime stories. It's
interesting you say that. I think that just shows that Jim Sheridan is not a documentary maker, because like that's, whereas that would have been expected in the 80s and 90s, like that's just isn't it? It's considered just so.
It's cliched. It's outdated. It's
it is outdated. We've grown since then. We have better film making abilities and understandings now, and we know how to tell a story without a cheesy reenactment. Having said that, though, as I said, both of them start with the hook. So after Jim's initial kind of intro, it then goes into the murder. But it kind of ambles its way into the murder. I felt like the Netflix one was just like, bam, murder. And it nearly felt rushed. Like they nearly brought the murder in too suddenly and without the same background that Jim went into in the first episode. Is that a fair statement to make?
It is fair. And I think the other thing that the Netflix did at the very beginning in the opening, they actually had an equally naff montage of images of the murder. And you know, it kind of opens with the local publican, this little old man, very sweet, adorable man that I would probably listen to talk for
He's
hours.
Very likable.
But you know, they open with him, and then it goes into this kind of, as I said, montage about what occurred, and then how the Gardaí tried to make the specialist forensic team try and make their way down in Christmas traffic to West Cork, and the investigation begins. But it's all very sudden and quick, and you don't really get time to take in what's happened. Whereas I know we're probably going to give Jim Sheridan a little bit of a hard time. He kind of ponders it and muses over it a little bit. And there's, you know, there's a bit more kind of emotion conveyed in it, as kind of silly as the reenactment is, and as annoying as it is to see an older white man centered in this woman's story. There is kind of an emotional resonance in the Jim Sheridan one,
because he's an expert storyteller. Like, he knows how to, a documentary maker or not, he knows how to, you know, unwind a spiel, and that's exactly what he does. But it's funny, you kind of touched on it already, like that there's those cliches in the two of them. Like in Jim Sheridan's one, it's, you know, there's a line, something to the effect of, you know, he's talking about how he's always been obsessed with this case, and 25 years later, and then he's like, the hills call out for answers. And I'm like, oh, for It's just so
Jim,
cliched.
Stop it.
It's no, they're not. They're inanimate fucking objects, Jim. Stop talking out of your hoop.
The hills are going to be there an awful lot longer than we are.
We're from Ireland.
Don't give a shit.
Everything's mystical and magical.
Yeah.
The hills want answers. But like, and then on the flip of that, in the Netflix one, they have that lovely bar owner, and he's in both, and he's super, super likable. But there's this really cliched, clearly staged, clearly produced bit in the first episode of the Netflix one where like the, you know, West Kerry publican is, you know, he's doing a piece to camera, but he's like, you know, looking off to the side and the arms are crossed and he's like, sure, nothing ever happened around here until it did. You know, it's just this really dramatic, like nobody fucking talks like that. Like it's like a badly written piece of dialogue. And the
Billy, we need a bit for the teaser.
Yeah, yeah. It's like the producer said, that's good. Could you try that again and maybe say something? And like kind of gave him the words and kind of fed it to him. Like it just didn't ring through. True. And
Isn't
then
he also kind of sitting kind of in the middle of his pub with like nothing around him as well? It just,
that's a really
feels
classic
really
Netflix thing.
staged.
They do that.
He's you know, it's uncomfortable looking.
Yeah.
You know, it is very kind of produced appearing. So yeah, it's funny the differences that they manage. And literally those are the first 3 to 5 minutes we've just gone over of each documentary. We've only got, you know, 7 hours and 40 minutes to go. But yeah, the differences are very stark from the beginning, from the two of them. Yeah. And they really kind of do set up how the rest of each of those series is going to evolve over their run. So
100%. There's like, on Jim Sheridan's side, there's, you know, production wise, the imagery and the camera work are like, you know, very Hollywood, very, you know, epic film-esque. And not really what we're used to in a crime doc. You know, initially it was a little bit jarring. I remember in the first episode, it's kind of, I don't know if I like this or not. It's too much like a movie, but like as it went on, it did really grow on me actually. The Netflix one then is like just literally Netflix by numbers. Like it's like what you said there, the way they have the publican sitting out in the middle of the pub. That's something they do the whole time. And if you look back through off the top of my head, the Wild Wild West one, that's another one that they have them kind of sitting in the middle of a room and it's like nearly this empty space around them. I don't know if that's to kind of make them feel uncomfortable. So they'll talk, they'll give out more information. Maybe that's a kind of a journalistic move on their part, but that's a really classic thing that Netflix do. And you'll notice that in a lot of their documentaries. The two first episodes of both Jim Sheridan's and Netflix, like I said, they both kind of end up with the same conclusion. And I know I'm rushing up, but like you said, we've 8 hours of stuff to get through here. They both, by the end of both episodes, we have been fingered in the direction of Ian Bailey being the prime suspect. So in Jim Sheridan's one, he's rousing suspicion because he seems to know too much about this crime. And again, for anybody listening that's not familiar with this case outside of Ireland and France, Ian Bailey was an English journalist, freelance journalist who had moved to West Cork in the 70s, I think. I could be wrong. I think it was in the 70s. But he moved over there, and this is a part of Ireland that kind of attracts the arty scene. And so he moved there and he was working as a freelance journalist, and he seemed to know more about the case than the average journo. He was kind of alluding to the fact that he had an inside source from the Gardaí, the Irish Guards, and they said, you know, he didn't. So that's kind of how the Jim Sheridan one ends up. The first episode is that he's, you know, kind of, they're wondering if he knows, how does he know so much about the crime? And then with the Netflix one, it actually handles it completely different. So I'm going to throw this one over to you. It's the introduction of Marie Farrell.
Yeah, so Marie Farrell kind of first comes to the Garda attention in the case when she, as they're doing house-to-house inquiries, they hand out these sheets of paper asking people what their whereabouts was um, on uh, on certain days in the run up to Sophie Toscan du Plantier's murder. Marie Farrell she owned, well, ran a clothes shop in the middle of Skull Town, and she realized that Sophie had been in her shop
Mm-hmm.
on the 21st or 22nd, I'm not sure of the date there. She had been in the shop, and not only that, but Marie Farrell had noticed that there was a strange man standing outside the shop across the road.
Mm-hmm.
And she got the impression that the man was watching this woman, and that when Sophie left the shop, that the man was following her. And then Marie Farrell kind of disappears from the story, and another witness comes in. Gardaí had been appealing for people to come forward from the public. There was a crime call program that was broadcast nationally on RTE, and the Gardaí appeared on that asking for people to get in touch with them, and somebody did. It was a woman named who gave her name as Fiona. She didn't want to come into the Gardaí
Mm-hmm.
and speak to them, but she said that on the night of the 22nd of December, she had been driving in the middle of the night, around somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, from the direction of Skull, past a place called Kilfada Bridge, which is just at the very end of the laneway that leads to the laneway that leads to the laneway where Sophie lived.
Mm-hmm.
And she said as she turned this corner, her headlights caught a man in the light, and she would later say that this man was Ian Bailey.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
If you love to be remembered as the person who gives the best birthday gifts, I'm here to tell you that 1-800-Flowers.com is your ultimate birthday gifting destination. 1-800-Flowers has thoughtful and artfully created options that are guaranteed to deliver the best birthday surprise. Shop thousands of unique gifts at 1-800-Flowers.com for exclusive offers and great values. To order today, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/tune-in. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/tune-in.
Bolt your doors, lock your windows, turn off your lights, and come with me into the Weird Darkness. I'm Darren Marlar, the host of Weird Darkness, where I bring you true tales of the paranormal, supernatural, legends, lore, the strange and bizarre, mysterious, macabre, unsolved, and unexplained. Episodes posted 7 days a week. Listen to Weird Darkness in the Spreaker podcast player app, and you can also comment on individual episodes, and I can respond to those comments. Look for Weird Darkness on the Spreaker podcast player app.
Eventually, Gardaí were able to discover that Fiona was in fact Marie Farrell. She'd made the mistake of, instead of ringing from a public phone box, which she'd done on the first 2 occasions she contacted Gardaí, she rang from her home phone, and they called to her house. And so they had this witness who identified the suspect, Ian Bailey, as being the man who was watching Sophie outside the shop, and as a man that she said appeared drunk and completely out of it
Mm-hmm.
on Kilfada Bridge on the night that Sophie was killed. And she's a compelling character.
Mm-hmm.
There's footage from back in the day. I think it's probably the late 90s. It's a number of years after Sophie is killed, but they have archive footage of Marie Farrell telling her story, and she is a very compelling witness. She said that it was this tall, strange man in a big long coat with a funny hat on him, and he was acting very erratically, and there was a full moon
And
that
these
night.
were clothing items that were, synonymous in the area with
Yes.
Ian Bailey. He wore this funny hat, he wore this long black coat, and like that, and he was very tall. And these are features that, they're not easily mixed in a small town like Skull. He would have stuck out, and then if you see somebody, like you said, outside your clothes shop following the victim a couple of days before her murder, and then the night of her murder, the same guy is spotted on a bridge, as you said, like just down the road from her house. It, you know, that you would assume that it's, even if you didn't know who Ian Bailey was, you know, that's what he was kind of known for dressing as in the area.
And, you know, he was known for kind of acting erratically too. You know, there were lots of, and we hear, I think it's specifically in the Netflix documentary, a lot of his kind of bizarre and strange habits and customs, you know, that he had a big walking stick, and he would call pubs to order and then recite like bad poetry and and all this kind of stuff. So and with that said as well, Marie Farrell didn't know Ian Bailey. She didn't know him until she'd made this Garda statement. And she didn't know Sophie Toscan du Plantier. She recognized her as the woman that had been in her shop, you know, when the news broke, but she didn't know either of these people. And you know, that's a fairly credible witness, you would think, that that somebody who had no skin in the game, she didn't have an axe to grind, she had nothing to gain, it would seem, by coming forward. And the reason, and the only reason she didn't give the full details to Gardaí was that the night that she was driving on the 22nd into the 23rd, she said that there was a man in the car with her, a married man who was not her husband, and that they had had a previous relationship, and she had told her husband that she'd gone for drinks with the girls that night, but in fact she was meeting up with this ex. She said it wasn't an affair, she just wasn't honest with her husband, and she didn't want him to know exactly what had happened, and that's the only reason she didn't come forward immediately with the information. As I said, very, very credible person. But subsequently, we then, well, firstly, we hear that Marie Farrell, as time goes on, is being harassed by Ian Bailey. He's coming into her shop, and there's solicitors' letters flying back and forth, and all this carry on. So she appears as a witness for the newspapers in Ian Bailey's subsequent libel trial, where she describes all this for the court. But by the time we get to when Ian Bailey is suing the state and An Garda Síochána, she's flipped sides. She now says, none of that happened. She says, I did see a man at Kilfada Bridge, and I did see a man outside the shop, but it wasn't Ian Bailey. The guards told me to say that it was Ian Bailey, and the guards told me to say that Ian Bailey was harassing me. It never happened. It's all a setup.
And it's such a game changer, because, you know, this was the only evidence they had that, you know, that ID'd him, that kind of put him with Sophie, because, you know, unfortunately, that's the big smoking gun in this case, in this murder, is that there's nothing tangible that has him at the location. It's all circumstantial.
Anybody back at the location. We go back to the crime scene, and there's a few finger marks that were not identified, but there's no DNA that's found. We're well before the time of touch DNA. The guards went up to her house that morning and gained entry, expecting to find, you know, a bloody mess of this house, and there was nothing there. Everything was as if she had just gone to the front door to collect her milk in the morning. Like, there was nothing untowards about the house. Her keys were still in the door. There was a book sitting on her dining table, open to a page, being held open with a little jar of honey. There was nothing untoward at all in her home. So there was no physical evidence whatsoever. And with Marie Farrell, this kind of helped Garda suspicion that was already upon Ian Bailey at this stage. It helped firm that up. And remember as well that the public were finding out about the details of what the guards had on Ian Bailey at his libel trial. And then the next, we're thinking, you know, the public is thinking, oh, Marie Farrell, look, I mean, she's a great witness, blah, 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 blah. And then by the next time we see her, a few years later,
Yeah.
She's completely changed her tune, and again seems very believable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the really difficult thing, is that, you know, you've got people making one statement and then going back on it, or you've got people saying this happened and somebody else saying, well, I didn't mean it like that. That's, you know, there's context you're missing in that.
I think I said it to you in the production meeting. Like, I came away from both documentaries going, it's no fucking wonder this isn't solved. Like, it's just, and not to be flippant, it's such a clusterfuck. Like, God almighty, with the things that had to go wrong for, you know, for the guards and say Sophie's family's side, and all the things that had to go right on the side of the killer, for this person to still be at large and still, you know, not having been held accountable. It's just, I mean, what are the chances? I think you said if you wanted to go into a place and leave no trace of yourself, you couldn't. Like, it was just absolutely potluck.
It's just one of those bizarre moments where if this had been planned, there would have been something.
Yeah.
There would have been, but it appears to have been such a blitz attack, that there was just nothing. And it was in the dead of night. It's in this very rural, isolated place. There's nothing around for miles. Some people say that you know, kind of in the middle of the night, they thought they heard someone screaming, but it could have been an animal or a fox or something. And yes, on that note, there are multiple fox screams throughout.
There must have been a sale on she-fox screaming sounds, because they were used ad nauseum in both documentaries. I think they just think every Irish country, like, I live in the back arse of nowhere. I live 3 miles from the nearest village. I never heard of she-fox till a couple of years ago. Like, and I'm 34. No. Like, do you know what I mean? It's not actually that common.
No, they tend not to scream. Actually, you're more likely to hear a cat fight than you are to hear a fox screaming. But
cat's mating.
yeah, what a pleasant sound. But at this point, we all now know what a fox screaming sounds like, because at least Jim Sheridan uses it 3 or 4 times.
Yes,
in the space of a few hours.
It's now my ringtone. But like with both Netflix and the Jim Sheridan version, you know, moving on to episode 2 of both, we have at this stage been introduced in both series to Dermot Dwyer, who is the guy in charge of the investigation of Sophie's murder. He in the Netflix one, and again, I suppose it kind of plays into that twiddly Irish, you know, there's a line where he says, you know, the fella that did this is a fella that lost it completely in the head. And I just thought it was like the most quintessentially Irish thing that a detective could say. I mean, and not wrong, but, you know, as well, I suppose on the Netflix end of things, they are focusing on how it seems that Ian Bailey is flagging this story of Sophie Toscan du Plantier as, you know, a slut, really, isn't he?
Sex fiend.
Yeah, like sex crazed Pandora.
Yeah, she is having all sorts of crazy parties in her house. She's had multiple lovers over to West Cork, and it seems the Gardaí feel that he's trying to direct attention away from West Cork and towards France. That, you know, perhaps there was a hit taken out on Sophie, and a hitman found the place in Cork in the first instance, which would be very difficult. It's hard to find on Google Maps, never mind if you're driving around in these tiny roads, and then had a weapon of choice as a rock that he found nearby. You know, the
most ill-equipped hitman ever, the worst hitman in the world ever, you know, relying on something at the scene to kill her.
Nothing behind as well. So, you know, there was that suggestion, and, you know, she did have an affair at one point with a man named Bruno. It had begun just shortly after she married Daniel Toscan du Plantier, and he had been to West Cork a number of times, but their relationship had broken up in 1993. It was not a good breakup. There was a suggestion that he was a bit controlling, and Sophie was not that. She would not be controlled, and she just ended things with him. And you know, the Gardaí contacted authorities in France, who wouldn't let them actually go to France and interview people, interestingly enough, which, you know, I find a bit rich. You know, there's a lot to be said that the guards can be criticized about in how they handled this case, but you know, there's no throwing stones in glass houses, as they say. You know, France was not terribly cooperative with the Irish authorities to begin with. In the end of it, Bruno was able to say that he was at a conference or some sort of art event in the 3 days before Christmas, and they put him in Paris at that time. So there's no suggestion that he or Daniel, Sophie's husband, had been in Ireland at any point. Nobody saw them. You know, you'd think a strange car in the Skull area or in and around the Mizen Peninsula would have been seen as well. It wasn't. So, you know, the idea of all of these stories coming through, particularly being written by Ian Bailey, the man who seems to know too much, you know, it really made Gardaí very suspicious, and you know, it just kind of cemented the various kind of strings that they were drawing on this strange man who knows too much and seems to be trying to direct the investigation out of the country, when it seems like the answers are probably way more local to Sophie than he was letting on.
Absolutely. At this point in episode 2 as well, we're kind of introduced to the, you know, the myth and the folklore and, like I said, the twiddly eye kind of aspect of the storytelling in the Netflix one. Now, Jim Sheridan definitely touches on it as well in his series of events, but we have, like we mentioned kind of earlier in the episode, we have this foreshadowing going on, so that both series, docu-series, talk about how Sophie had this paranormal, I mean, what do you call it, even experience the day before her death.
I don't know. I think we find out a lot more about Sophie, and I think she's just kind of more spooky than we thought she was. Yeah. And she went walking on her own in this very isolated part of the peninsula, and a place called Three Castle Hill, I believe, or Three Castle Rock, or Three Castle Lake.
Three Castle Head. I had to think there for a minute. Three Castle Head, yes.
I was wrong on all points. But she goes there, and there's a white lady story about this place. The ghost of a very sad woman who died in tragic circumstances.
Of course.
Because that's what the white lady is.
That's what they always do.
Basically every single town in Ireland, there's a white lady story, where some, you know, just married woman, or she never got to get married, or you know, one of these kind of stories.
Miss Haversham kind of job.
Yes, exactly. So, you know, she saw something and she had this terrible feeling, and she went to her friends who owned land near where she was walking on her own there, and said that she just had this awful feeling. And there's this kind of intimation that had Sophie approached someone locally, they would have taken the story, they would have known this mythology about this white lady story, and would have taken it far more seriously and never let her leave the house. And
would they have?
They would have.
Would we have?
have a drop of whiskey.
Yes, you have to dance in the stone circle under the light of the moon, and you'll break the curse.
And let me tell you the 20 stories that we all have about the time Auntie Mary was drunk off her arse down at Three Castle Head and saw the white lady and blah, 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 blah. So it would have, it was it was very twee in both series. I got really annoyed at both of them, I have to admit. Like this kind of weird paranormal, as if anything there's anything paranormal about being beaten to death with a rock outside your house. It felt really incongruous with the rest of how, like,
do you know what? It kind of reminded me of a crime scene, The Vanishing at Cecil Hotel, the Elisa Lam documentary. It's the same. It's this. Sad. They're trying to drag in a paranormal aspect, and you're like, look, it's just a poor young girl who had a psychotic episode because she was off her meds, like simple as. And I'd do the same if I hadn't taken my meds for that length of time. But yeah, it's this trying to make it otherworldly. But I think that happens a lot. And not just in true crime documentaries, in podcasts as well. There does seem to be a kind of a true crime, paranormal, mush it all together. It's all the one category nearly. By contrast, at the same period of time in Jim Sheridan's series, what they're focusing on now is the Christmas swim. And what was her name? Florence Newman.
Yes.
And Bailey's hands. So I'm going to let you talk us through that.
So in the days after Sophie's death, because the struggle happened down at the very bottom of the lane leading into her house, there's that barbed wire fence, but it's also grown over very thick with brambles, or what they call in the documentary briars. So there's all these briars with these thorns, and they figure that whatever struggle happened there probably meant that the perpetrator of the crime would also have been very badly scratched up with these thorns, because Sophie had suffered a number of kind of really bad, like, scratches and gashes to her skin from these bushes basically that are nearby. So Gardaí were on the lookout for people who had unexplained scratches and kind of tears to their skin that might have been caused by briars, brambles, or thorns. Yeah. And a number of people, including Frances Newman, who took the video of the Christmas Day swim in Skull in 1996, reported seeing scratches on Ian Bailey's skin. That there were kind of irregular, jagged marks on his hands and up his arms. Now there's, in the Jim Sheridan documentary, we're kind of told about it, and we get to think, oh, that's very bad for Ian Bailey. And then later we return to the footage and see that, as she described it, she had said that his hands were plunged deep in his pockets, and that he'd kind of seemed to be trying to hide his hands, and that he then shook her hand, and that's when she noticed these scratches. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen in the video. Yeah. So we're kind of led to question whether that occurred. But other people did see the scratches on his hands, including Gardaí, who called to Ian Bailey's house. Tell
us what they did, Sinead.
What do you think they did? So they go to the house and they see the scratches and they think, what the hell is that from? They ask Ian Bailey, what did you do? And he said, I was climbing a tree. On the 21st of December, I lopped off the top of a Sitka spruce.
Fair enough. It's Christmas time.
To save some money, to put it in the house as a Christmas tree. And while doing so, I scratched up my arms. And the guards were looking at these scratches and thought, that seems rather unlikely. So not only did they actually climb some spruce trees and see if they had similar scratches, they decided to draw a picture of Ian Bailey's hands to demonstrate said scratches. So we're presented in the documentary with this drawing of something resembling a hand, a human hand, with
it's like make and do with John or something. Like, honest to God, it's like something you'd see a 5-year-old do. It's just laughable.
It is. I have a 6-year-old, and I think the effort there would have been at least a bit of glitter on it. If it's, like, there would have been some sort of artistic, there would have been artistic merit. But this thing is just the most, it's the most awful point for me in the documentary.
And it's
Seeing
embarrassing.
this, it's embarrassing.
As
it's
a nation.
utterly embarrassing. And now Dermot Dwyer does intimate that there was perhaps some sort of issue with the taking of a photograph, and that's not a piece of law that I'm familiar with. So I don't know if a guard can roll up to your house and say, hey, can I snap a picture of your hands or your face? I don't know if a warrant would be required to do something, and so it's possible that there was some sort of problem with it. However, it's just the most embarrassing thing because it's pitiful. Now, I guess there's at least some record that guards saw something that they decided to take a record of, and that's better than nothing, I guess. But presenting the world with this picture, like as if it's something of evidential value when it's simply not, is the most embarrassing thing. So, you know, with those things, people then tend to discount this notion that Bailey had scratches on his arms, but you know, a number of people did see them, and he kind of had done a number of things all on the same day. He cut the tree down, and he'd also slaughtered 3 turkeys, and he said he got a scratch on his face in the process of slaughtering the turkeys, which Gardaí again disbelieved and drew a really crude picture of again. But people that he had seen on the 21st when he was out in the pub said that they saw no such scratches on him.
And it's this constant back and forth, isn't it? Kind of like, I saw this. No, you didn't. This happened. No, it didn't. It just shows like the fragility of, you know, memory, and that we can't always take what I'm sure are good, honest, decent people, you know, and they are convinced that they saw what they saw when they saw it. But it's, you know, and I'm not saying they didn't, but it's that kind of, you know, people can give statements with the best of intentions, and then you've got the same good people with the same set of good intentions contradicting them completely, or in fact saying no, that it just didn't happen. It just didn't happen. What happens then in the Jim Sheridan one is that we have the confessions. So the beginning of the confessions. So this seems to add fuel to the fire. If so far everything is circumstantial, you know, like we said, we know we've had Mary Farrell, but she's then kind of reneged on her statement subsequently. We have these confessions from several of the locals, I should say. So it's not one, it's not two, it's like, it's upwards of 4 or 5, am I right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think at one point the number 8 is mentioned, but I can kind of off the top of my head recall 4 or 5 of them. And it's just, it's so strange. There are a couple that I'm willing to give him a pass on, but some of them I just can't. So the first one comes about when Ian Bailey is ringing the Dublin offices of the Irish Examiner, the paper that he'd been making these articles for about the case. And
I'm assuming he's making decent money as well, because he was kind of, you know, until he became the prime suspect, he was the go-to guy. He was, you know, there are folders and folders of the articles that he was writing about the salacious, you know, supposed salacious love life of Sophie Toscan du Plantier. So, you know, before her subsequent murder, like he had a couple of articles been published daily.
Yeah, and he would, you know, call on a weekly basis and check in with them and pitch stories to them. And it was in one of these phone calls he was speaking to Helen Callanan, one of the editors of the paper, and she had heard through the grapevine that Ian Bailey was on the suspect list, and that Gardaí thought that he could have possibly had something to do with it. And she was very rightly annoyed, firstly, that, you know, he's a suspect, that's a big deal. And then secondly, that he as a suspect was writing articles for her newspaper. If
Yeah.
there's anything to kind of stand back and say, oh, well, I might be a little bit too involved in this to be writing about it. You'd think that would be it, but Bailey didn't do that, even though he knew at that point that he was a suspect. And
I haven't really woken up until I've had my McDonald's breakfast deal. And I know this is true because before breakfast, I put my phone in the refrigerator and couldn't find the keys that were already in my hand.
Nothing gets the morning going like the first sip of an iced coffee. Get any size and any flavor for 99 cents until 11 a.m. Price and participation may vary.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. McDonald's, I'm loving it.
Bolt your doors, lock your windows, turn off your lights, and come with me into the Weird Darkness. I'm Darren Marlar, the host of Weird Darkness, where I bring you true tales of the paranormal, supernatural, legends, lore, the strange and bizarre, mysterious, macabre, unsolved, and unexplained. Episodes posted 7 days a week. Listen to Weird Darkness in the Spreaker podcast player app, and you can also comment on individual episodes, and I can respond to those comments. Look for Weird Darkness on the Spreaker podcast player app.
Helen Callanan said this to him, and in response, Bailey says, oh yeah, of course I did this because I'm trying to resurrect my career. And Helen Callanan was quite shocked. She took the statement very literally, and she told Gardaí about it. And, she has maintained that this, was a confession to her. It was a very shocking statement that he had made. Now, Ian Bailey says that this was sarcasm and he didn't mean it. And, this is one of the ones that I'm willing to give him a pass on. It's like the Malachi Reed confession. He was a 14-year-old that was a neighbor of Ian Bailey and Jules Thomas. And Ian Bailey was giving him a lift home, and Malachi had asked, how are things? And Bailey allegedly responded, everything was fine until I went up there and bashed her head in with a brick. And
he's
again,
like 14.
He's 14.
14.
And Bailey as well is drunk. Because this is why Malachi didn't immediately tell his mother, because he was scared he would get into trouble for taking a lift with somebody who had been drinking. But again, even though Malachi says, there wasn't sarcasm, it wasn't everything was fine until people said I went up there, he is still to this day quite, certain that it was everything was fine until...
You could argue that maybe a 14-year-old might not be familiar with the nuances of sarcasm, but it's not a joke that you make to a 14-year-old. It's not a joke really that you make to anyone other than, if somebody is like you were saying, he initially made that joke of resurrecting his career. I don't think that's really a joke you make, but B, Jesus, it's a case of knowing your audience as well. And, if you maybe have a very close friendship with someone who gets your humor, then you can make that kind of dark joke. But I guess that kind of plays into what we learn later on, and that's he has some kind of a personality disorder, which maybe isn't the biggest shock. He definitely is at the very least completely socially inept. Like he just doesn't know how to behave in the company of polite, of decent thinking people.
Just any other normal people. And, and I use the word normal in a kind of non-pejorative sense. Like the vast majority of people would fall into that category, and he doesn't. But with those confessions, I'm kind of willing to give those to him, even though I believe that those people believe that they heard what they heard. But there are some that just don't.
It can't be explained.
They can't be explained by this sarcasm or black humor. Or like the worst thing about it is the explanation of, well, maybe people, he's British, he's English, and, he's a very dry sense of humor. And so maybe those stupid Irish people just don't understand sarcasm.
We're just not that funny, Sinead, to be honest with you. Or clever or educated.
Clever, funny, not us. Definitely not us. Certainly not. But there are some that, they're not sarcastic. It's not sarcasm to invite people to your home, to be crying, to be shit-faced drunk, and to say, I did it, I went too far.
That was the one that got me.
Showing. Yeah.
That was the one that
Like,
got me. He's crying and like shaking the guy and going, I did it, I went too far. Well, like,
and they
if
ran
it's a joke,
from the
cry.
house.
Yeah.
They ran from the house. And then the other one, is it Billy Fuller, I think is his name. Not Billy, is it Billy? The other man, he called to the house, and Bailey offered him a drink. He didn't take the drink because he was working, and it somehow came about that Ian Bailey turned to him and said, you saw her in the spa and you saw her tight arse and you fancied
Jesus, I'd
that.
forgotten about that one. Yeah.
And you went up to the house and you went too far. You chased her and you stove in the back of her head with a rock, and you went too far. And this really scared that man. He's told the same story for the past 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
He feels that it was Bailey confessing in the second person. And he stood by it enough that he went to France, after so many years of not being able to bring a case against Ian Bailey for the alleged murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier. France went ahead and did their own investigation, and in 2020, so last year, held a trial without him present, and he was convicted in absentia of the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier, and that's gone through in detail later in the documentaries. But he actually went to France. He paid money out of his own pocket, made his way over there to give this testimony, and one of the very few people who traveled from Ireland to go over there.
And that's that's a really nice segue into the next part of the Netflix version of events, because we're then at the point where they're trying to figure out the sequence of events, because like that's another thing, and we've touched on it briefly, is the confusion in the crime scene. Obviously, she was found at the bottom of the lane, which is quite a distance from the house. She had her boots on, but her night clothes. But like you'd imagine then if you put boots on, there was time, that there was...
Yeah, she knew she was going outside.
You knew you were going outside, exactly.
Yeah.
And if you're fleeing from someone you're afraid of, would you pause to put boots on, or was she already outside when she met? So there's a lot of confusion. And then obviously the fact that there's nothing inside the house disturbed, there's no DNA found inside the house, but yet there's like a blood mark on the handle. So she was killed at the bottom of the lane, like, what is it? And I'm trying to think even in meters. Is it 500 meters away?
No, it's about 100, I think.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah. So it's,
and then there's blood on the door, but like the murder scene is 100 meters away. So did he go, he or she or whoever killed her, go back up and close the door, or was,
try to open the door, but the door was locked?
Yeah.
Like that was one of the things as I was watching the documentary that really grabbed me. Like, by the time we had our production meeting, I had watched it a number of times. When I finished our production meeting, I watched it again a number of times. There were things that struck me so much that I screenshotted as I went through so that I could look back on things. And I spent basically the entire weekend back in Sophie Toscan du Plantier's murder land. That's what I was doing.
And cursing Gemma Delaney and cursing the fact that you ever agreed to do this.
At least I had some sort of outlet for it, because otherwise it's all in my brain. And the crime scene confused me. Yeah. And this is one thing that I think that both documentaries really fall down on. They are just telling a story, but they don't present any of the evidence or the timeline in any kind of linear fashion. So it's all chopping and changing in both of them, back and forth. So it's really difficult to see things as they unfolded, especially with the Netflix one, because the story isn't being told by one person. It's being told by a number of people.
5 million different contributors.
5 million different, some of them brilliant, and I'm sure we'll get to them.
Christ.
And some of them, you know, we could take or leave.
Yeah.
But there's no one to sit and go through everything with them. And I ended up spending, you know, a good 45 minutes looking at various crime scene photographs, trying to figure out just like what happened. Like, so she was talking to her husband sometime between 11 and midnight, and there was this impression that she was in bed. But yet somehow, you know, she still managed to get downstairs and put her shoes on, and the keys are in the door. And there was a question of whether or not there was somebody else in the house with her. And in fact, this is one of the articles that Ian Bailey wrote himself, saying that Gardaí thought that it was possible that there was somebody else in the house because there were 2 wine glasses left on the draining board in the kitchen. And the kitchen really fascinated me because I remembered back to when I was writing my own episode about the murder, that there had been speculation about the chairs in the kitchen. And so when you look at the kitchen table, it's kind of a long room, and at one end there's the sink and the draining board and the various kitchen-y things, and at the other end next to the window there's a dining room table, and there's 4 chairs arranged around it. And in the picture you see 2 of the chairs are pushed right up against the outer wall. And there was a suggestion that perhaps these 2 chairs meant that there was somebody else there. And later, Sophie's family explained that, in fact, when she was reading at the window, she liked to pull another chair up to put her feet up. There's a little radiator there. So she had kind of her whole body kind of curled around this radiator, looking out what was probably a very drafty window, reading a book. So, you know, that was interesting for me. And then there was, in fact, a book on the table as well. But when I looked at the picture of the book, it was actually facing the opposite direction. So the text was pointing kind of away from where Sophie's seats were. And it just, you know, it really struck me, you know, maybe there was somebody else in the house. You know, nobody left any DNA at the crime scene. And I suppose it's entirely possible that you could walk into somebody's house and not shed hair or touch DNA again, as we said earlier, wasn't a thing then. So if nothing happened in the house, then why would it be disturbed? I think maybe we've kind of glossed over that in previous years in terms of the investigation a little bit too much, and there might be something to it. So maybe there was somebody there was the struggle down at the end of the lane. Maybe that person then came back up to the house to either get into the house and found that the door had been shut, or went back up to shut the door, which seems very strange to me.
It does, doesn't it?
It does. And there was also a sighting as well of Sophie's lights on in her house, or lights at least in the cluster of 3 houses where Sophie lived, you know, sometime after 2 a.m. that night.
And tell us who saw that, Sinead.
And who do you think saw it? It was Ian Bailey and Jules Thomas. They had been in a pub that evening on the 22nd, and they told Gardaí that they took the long way home through an area called Hunt's Hill, and they stopped at the top of the hill to look at the full moon. And Ian Bailey looked across out towards the bay and saw that there were lights on.
And he knew her neighbors. He was friendly with her neighbors.
Yes, he'd done work for Sophie's neighbours, Alfie Lyons and Shirley Fowler, and he had said to Jules, it's reported in both documentaries as a kind of 2 different statements he made. One, look, Alfie Lyons' lights are on. I wonder if there's a party. Will we go over? And Jules is like, no way, we're going home. Yeah. And then the second one is that something terrible is going to happen tonight.
I mean, come on.
I know. It's all like, but either way, he's on the hill. he sees lights. This is important evidence, even if we take the fact that it's Ian. Just take the fact that it's Ian Bailey out of it. There's lights on, and it wasn't coming from Alfie Lyon's house because he said he went to bed, earlier in the evening. So it wasn't his. There was nobody in the third house. That was a holiday home as well, and it was empty at the time. The only other house it could have been was Sophie's. So this is important anyway. She was up, the lights were on. Now we don't know if the lights were on
between the two of them, because he's claiming he doesn't know her, he's never met her, they've never been introduced. He knows there's a French woman living up there somewhere near Alfie Lyon's house, but doesn't know her. But yet in this, it seems like a massive omission on his part. You think it'd be when he was first, questioned by the guards, it'd be one of the first statements he'd make. If there was anything linking, if I got pulled in, if the fucking doorbell went there now and there's two guards outside and go, hi, there's after been a murder up the road, we're just wanting to know, do you know anything about it? I'd be racking my brain for anything. And I go, I don't know the person, but actually funny you should say that. The night that they were murdered, I actually was driving by and I noticed the light on was on in the house. And I actually said I got a feeling that something weird was going to happen, or that I thought there was a party on in my friend's house and will we go over there? Like, that's the kind of thing you'd fucking bring up.
You would say it.
Unless you're something tight.
It's just one of those kind of bizarre moments.
There's so many though. That's the thing. There's so many bizarre things.
And then, with everybody saying one thing and it being contradicted later, did it even happen? Like Jules said it did, but did it even happen? And then, this is kind of echoed again in, I really, really liked how the Netflix documentary dealt with Ian Bailey's timeline as well. Yeah. Because I think that's really important and it's not kind of laid out anywhere. We all kind of know exactly what Sophie was up to. She goes for her walk, she stops at O'Sullivan's for a cup of tea, and, she's kind of tooling around the place. But Ian Bailey's timeline has always been a bit sketchy. He's climbed his Sitka spruce, he's killed his turkeys, and he's gone to a couple of pubs, and that's kind of all we know of.
He's been roundhouse kicked by a turkey.
Yeah. Like, aren't you supposed to hold the legs? And why would you hold it near your face? Like, he's a very tall man. You would think that he'd be able to get a bit of length away from his face.
But also, if this is something you're experienced in, he rears chickens and turkeys, it's not his first rodeo. You think, common sense would dictate, hold them away from your face.
And he spends half of Jim Sheridan's documentary yelling at chickens.
I was going to say, in the fucking chicken coop.
Bloody chickens. Like, he's in and out with the chickens all the time. But this timeline is something that kind of fascinated me. So I watched the Jim Sheridan documentary first and was very much kind of like he's a really shit person, but is there enough there really? But then when I watched the Netflix one, and they very clearly lay this out, his timeline on the 23rd of December, so the day that Sophie's body is found. The main thing is that he gets this phone call from Eddie Cassidy at about 20 to 2 saying that there has been a murder. Now, it's up for discussion whether Eddie Cassidy says there's been a French woman killed or there has been a foreigner killed in Tourmore. But either way, it's after this that Ian Bailey and Jules Thomas hop in their little car and drive directly over to Sophie Toscan du Plantier's house. But before this, there are some very interesting happenings. At about 11:45, Ian Bailey rang someone he had an appointment with and said, there's been a murder, I won't be able to go. He rings somebody else 15 minutes before and says, that turkey, I can't drop it over to you. There's been a murder. I must go report on it. And then at 11:15, Jules Thomas is seen in Skull by a local resident who asks after Ian, and she says Ian is off investigating a murder. And it is only 45 minutes before that Sophie's body is found at the bottom of the lane. Yeah. And to me, if those statements are correct, and if that sighting of Jules in Skull is correct.
Mhm.
Very difficult to know because that witness has actually since passed away.
Okay.
But you know, how did he know where to go? How did he know that there'd been a murder?
It's hugely damning because that
It's-
timeline says that Eddie Cassidy didn't ring him until 20 to 2. And there's 3-4 separate instances where he, you know, by other people's reckoning, knew about
Knows.
the murder before that. So
And then
how
the
did he
Eddie
know if
Cassidy
he's saying he didn't know till 20 to 2?
And the Eddie Cassidy call in itself is important because Eddie Cassidy said it was a non-national, not a French woman, a lady, a non-national lady. And Ian Bailey and Jules Thomas drove directly to Sophie Toscan du Plantier's house. So now, of course, Ian Bailey said Eddie Cassidy told him it was a French woman. He'd been introduced or pointed out. Sophie had been pointed out to him briefly by Alfie Lyons 18 months before. He knew there was a French lady who lived next to his friend's house. And so they kind of on spec decided to go out there and see.
And look, maybe he's telling the truth. I mean, it's all very
would be
sus.
true.
It's all
And
sus.
of course, Ian Bailey and Jules Thomas say that they were in their house, the Prairie, about a 10-minute drive from Sophie's house all morning, and that those calls are incorrect and the sighting is incorrect. So they disagree with that forcefully.
And another thing as well that, you know, transpires through the course of the documentaries is that initially, obviously, Ian has a, you know, watertight alibi. He went home with Jules. Obviously, they made that detour, stopped on that bridge, saw the light, whatever. But they went home and they didn't stir all night. But then her version of events changes. Jules, Ian's partner, her version of events changes. And she says that, yeah, actually, you know, I think he did get up. And then he's like, actually, yeah, I did go up and I went down to, they have this little building across the lane and down slightly from their own house, this studio, because Jules is an artist, and that he went down there to do some writing. And then, you know, she actually states that, do you know what? Yeah, I don't know when he came back, but he brought me a cup of coffee at 9 o'clock in the morning. So there is a space of time where he could have left. And again, we're not saying he's guilty. We're not saying he's not. We're just saying that everything is very sus. And if nothing else, he's very unlucky.
He doesn't, yeah. He'll admit himself that he has no alibi.
Yeah.
And there's a really cringy scene in the Jim Sheridan documentary where he's listening to a Damien Dempsey song.
Oh, Jesus.
And I'm not a Damien Dempsey fan myself. It's not my thing. So it's the first time I'd ever heard the song. And it says I talk shite and I've got no alibi.
Yeah.
And just shortly after that, you know, Ian in that part of the documentary is pretty trashed. He's quite drunk. The camera pans across like bins with full of bottles of wine.
Yeah.
And then Jules says, you know, he's going to crash any minute. He's performing all the time.
And he has been on the wagon. He's off the wagon now. She does say that as well, that he was going to AA and he was doing great, and he's back on the booze now again. He's on one. And like you said, there's multiple scenes where he's absolutely hammered, talking shite, like so it brings the moment that the Irish Simpsons fan page has had an absolute field day with for the past week, which is the poem about the dolphins as well comes from about that time, which is where he's calling on the dolphins of the Atlantic to come and visit him because he has many questions. And it's just it's the worst piece of poetry that I've heard ever. And I remember it's doggerel. In the words of my favorite character in both of these pieces, it's Elizabeth Wassell, who says that she doesn't want to be mean, but she does describe his poetry as doggerel, and then
very, very on the nose, goes on to say writing is hard. And
Yeah.
I couldn't agree
Yeah.
more with Elizabeth Wassell.
It's like an inspirational quote.
Yeah, she's my new little totem. Writing is hard, very hard.
I mean, both series come to, if not the same conclusion, to the same point in the story, and that is, as you touched on earlier, it's the case that's brought against Ian Bailey in France, where he is convicted in absentia, basically. So he can't be extradited from Ireland, but he's found guilty in the courts in France, and this is brought about by this kind of group that's organized by her uncle, her family members, her son, obviously, who's now in his late 30s. And they're really the ones championing this and keeping, I suppose, Sophie's memory and case and the need for justice alive. He is convicted. He wasn't brought to trial over here because the DPP, for whatever reason, decided that the circumstantial evidence and the witnesses, that it wasn't.
Yeah. So the main thing that I think the DPP found was that the witnesses were unreliable, and without any now, like, that is completely up for argument. I think I can't throw away all of the witnesses.
Yeah.
However, without any kind of further physical or concrete evidence, it is very difficult to build a case.
Of course. Yeah, of course.
In this instance, because there's just no physical evidence.
But there's a huge volume of circumstantial evidence. Like I said, he's either the most unlucky fucker in the world to have so many coincidences, or he's the most lucky fucker in the world in that there is no physical evidence of him at the scene. And again, I'm not saying that he did it. I'm not saying he didn't, but it's such a peculiar story. And this is why it's had the attention of two nations for so long. Obviously, it's absolutely just...
If you love to be remembered as the person who gives the best birthday gifts, I'm here to tell you that 1-800-Flowers.com is your ultimate birthday gifting destination. 1-800-Flowers has thoughtful and artfully created options that are guaranteed to deliver the best birthday surprise. Shop thousands of unique gifts at 1-800-Flowers.com for exclusive offers and great values. To order today, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/tune-in. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/tune-in.
Bolt your doors, lock your windows, turn off your lights, and come with me into the Weird Darkness. I'm Darren Marlar, the host of Weird Darkness, where I bring you true tales of the paranormal, supernatural, legends, lore, the strange and bizarre, mysterious, macabre, unsolved, and unexplained. Episodes posted 7 days a week. Listen to Weird Darkness in the Spreaker podcast player app, and you can also comment on individual episodes, and I can respond to those comments. Look for Weird Darkness on the Spreaker podcast player app.
Gut-wrenchingly tragic. It's such a sad story. It's so sad that there's still no justice really for her family, and that they don't have concrete answers, and that they probably never will. But it is the quintessential whodunit. It's the quintessential game of Cluedo. It's the quintessential murder mystery.
That sometimes it's just that one thing. Like I know in our earlier conversation, I compared it to the Elaine O'Hara case.
Yes.
Where there was literally, a sequence of unlikely events that led to discovering who Graham Dwyer was.
Yeah.
So, there are keys found with a Dunnes Stores value customer tag next to a mobile phone in Dartry Reservoir. The fishermen who fished them out decided that they were strange and kept them, and then brought them to the guards. And then the guard decided to act on these kind of bizarre assortment of things that had been found. And then it was tied back to Elaine O'Hara, who was discovered dead just, I think, 2 weeks before her body was found in the Dublin Mountains, not far from Dartry Reservoir. And then the mobile phone, which linked into Graham Dwyer. Now, if that phone had not been there, there would be no conviction in that case.
Yeah.
There just wouldn't. There, like, even if
it doesn't bear thinking about. Sure, it doesn't.
It literally doesn't. It's that one thing. He made that one mistake, and he planned that. And he's still made that mistake. Like, and what happened to Sophie was not at all planned. You can tell just by looking at it. Like Dermot Dwyer says, you know, somebody lost the head.
Yeah.
And just so happened that they didn't leave anything that could be found at the time behind. But you know, the way the French system deals with things is much different from how the Irish system deals with things. Well, one thing, it's kind of a merge between a civil and a criminal trial, in that, like, the victim and their families are represented there. So Sophie's family had a lawyer present, and they also allow things like hearsay evidence, which is not at all allowed here. And the two documentaries deal with the portion about the French trial very differently.
They do.
And I think in a very kind of taken together, a very kind of complementary way. So in Jim Sheridan, they are at the trial, but they also have a cameraman in Ian Bailey's house. So we're seeing Bailey's reaction to this trial that he refuses to engage with, which is very interesting and very telling. Again, he's quite drunk throughout it, and it's nearly more interesting what he doesn't want to talk about than what he actually does. There are a few things that get put to him that he decides, you know, he doesn't want to talk about it just now, and he's kind of trying to control what's going on around him,
control the narrative, like, and nearly act as like a producer. He's like, you know, there's bits in the documentary where he like all but says cut, you know, can we do that? I think he even does he? There's a bit where he's like,
says,
you know, can we do that again?
Or he says, we'll cut here and we'll take this up tomorrow morning. I don't want to.
Oh, thanks.
I don't want to deal. Yeah. You know, so there's those kind of things. Like, he doesn't want to react to to the evidence.
It's very calculated, which doesn't come off very well for him if he is an innocent man. And like I said, I'm neither saying that he is or he isn't. But in terms of, you can give me one for each, or you can, you know, give me a collaborative. What's your favorite part, or what's the part you liked most in each documentary, or in the case at large?
So in the Netflix documentary, I really loved the way they set out Bailey's timeline, but I think more than that, I loved the way they used kind of home videos and a lot of content from her family.
Yeah.
Her family was very involved in
I would agree with that.
Production.
100%.
And we get a much better sense of who she was as a kind of well-rounded person. You know, she wasn't, you know, just a pretty blonde lady. She was actually kind of, you know, romantic and a bit spooky and, you know, a little bit weird and, you know, very independent. And you get the kind of impression that, you know, she'd be sitting drinking a glass of wine watching true crime documentaries herself. You know, she's you get a far better idea of who she is. And in the Netflix documentary, the very kind of last scenes, you hear her voice from the
such a nice touch, isn't
video.
it?
It's the first time I think any of us have ever heard her voice.
Well, I'd never heard her voice before.
I'd never heard her voice either. And it was just kind of the nicest thing. It was just very casual. And you just got this idea of like what a carefree but like deep thinking person she was, and you know how lovable she was, and you kind of want to be her friend. And then to think, you know, that this, you know, how we know about her and just how tragic that all is. So that would be my favorite bit about the Netflix one. And then my favorite bit about the Jim Sheridan one is it's not one particular thing, it's more the sense of it, the atmosphere of it. There's a kind of an ineffable emotion to what Jim Sheridan has presented. There's a very kind of authentic feel you get used to his narration throughout, and it's actually quite helpful, I think. Bringing the story together through kind of one person's perspective.
And it's funny, something that initially annoyed me about him, you know, and then I was
he's like okay, your comforting uncle in a pub.
And he's a master storyteller. He really is. You know, he guides you through the story, and it takes away that confusion that's maybe in the Netflix one. Yeah.
You know, and his kind of presence is very comforting, I think, because, you know, kind of the sadness and the tragedy of it, he makes that really clear. And he nearly uses there's kind of a lot of drone footage and stuff in it, and I think he nearly uses like this landscape of West Cork as a character of this kind of stark, lonely, you know, unforgiving, violent landscape, as Sophie herself called it, you know, a violent place.
The hills that are calling out for answers.
They need them. The dolphins can probably give the answers to the hills. But,
there's another poem in there somewhere.
I know. But you know, there's a great sense of the piece that he presents, so it's more than like kind of one thing. It's just kind of that sense behind what he's done, that is really authentic feeling and genuine feeling as well.
Was there anything in either documentary that was new information to you? Was there something that you had learned? Because obviously you've covered this case before in an episode of Mens Rea. So was there anything you learned, or was there anything that surprised you in the course of either watching these documentaries or, you know, any subsequent Googling that you did? You know, was there anything it didn't answer that you then wanted to Google, and then you're like, oh, okay, I found a strange answer too?
So there were two things in the Netflix documentary. I think the Netflix documentary was better in terms of kind of information. Yeah. And there were
I would agree with that.
Two things that kind of struck me in it. No, three things. I lie. Firstly, the way, again, they laid out that timeline of the day made me really question everything that I had heard before, because I needed to, from that, know who said what and when. Yeah. And so we're going to put a pin in that and come back to it in a second, because the other two things that I didn't know come from the French trial. So as I said, they can have hearsay witnesses, and some of those hearsay witnesses came to the court and told them. One of them was one of Sophie's good friends, Agnes, who said she had had a conversation with Sophie before she went to Cork about this strange Irish Polish guy who wanted to speak to her about something. And, you know, Agnes had said, oh, don't meet with him if he's weird, leave him alone, you know. And there was this kind of back and forth. And so it seemed that Sophie may have had contact with some sort of writer or artist in the West Cork area who wanted to work with her. And then there was another
piece about domestic violence, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's correct. It was about domestic violence. And that, we didn't get into that at all yet. To touch on that. So, and then the second piece was to do with a director friend of hers, whose last name I can't pronounce. His first name is Guy. And she had been saying that there was an Irish poet guy from West Cork that wanted to speak to her about cultural things, and had mentioned a name. And he said, oh yeah, I know that guy. He's, you know, from this part of France. And Sophie had said to him, no, this guy's from West Cork. You wouldn't know him. His name is Owen Bailey.
Dun, dun, dun. It's smoking gun.
I know. Owen Bailey is the name that Ian Bailey used as his nom de plume while writing for Irish newspapers here. Yeah. So there was that. And then there was also the testimony of a lady called Ariana, who had been in Jules Thomas's house, visiting Jules's daughter, one of her three daughters, that Christmas. So she had been in the house at the time that it's alleged by the French court that Ian Bailey murdered Sophie Toscan du Plantier. And she was never questioned. She eventually made a statement.
Isn't that mental?
I know, it's just insane. her statement was that she didn't have a whole bunch of contact with Ian Bailey. Jules's daughters seemed to try and avoid him, but she did see scratches on his arms, and she also went to take a shower at one point and discovered a very thick, heavy black piece of material soaking in a bucket. She thought it was a winter coat. It seemed odd to her because it's the middle of winter and, you know, it's a heavy object. They don't have a dryer. Nobody in 1996 in Ireland had a dryer. So they were reliant on line drying this coat. It was just, it was a weird thing. And so that's the evidence that she gave there. And in terms of the domestic violence, that gets brought up in the French court as well.
Yeah.
So we've got a number of occasions where Jules was reportedly struck by Ian Bailey. He does kind of take responsibility for it in the trials and says, yeah, it happened. I'm ashamed of it. And, you know, sometimes it takes two to tango.
I was going to say, but there was two of us in it or something.
Yeah,
you know,
like it's very...
if there's a but in an explanation, it's really, or an apology, it's really no apology at all, is it? You know,
it doesn't count. Yeah. Nobody's told Ian that, I guess. But... you know, one of the assaults was quite violent. We see one of the kind of local West Cork blow-ins describing bringing Jules to the hospital. And he is, you know, 25 years later in tears over, you know, the effect that it had on her and the effect it had on her kid. She had like tufts of hair like ripped from her scalp. And
it shows pictures. It shows pictures of the assault as well. It was violent.
It's bad. It was a violent assault. You know, and that's all taken together with diaries that Ian Bailey kept throughout the years to create this kind of psychological profile of him, which, as you said earlier, indicates that he has, you know, a borderline personality disorder without psychosis, that he's a narcissist, that he's, you know, just an awful person who has no conception of anybody beyond himself, which I think from watching the Jim Sheridan doc, I think that's, you know, pretty accurate. We get to see a lot of Ian Bailey, and he has no social skills. He thinks a lot of himself. He's like a self-styled you know, this century's Oscar Wilde, isn't he? He's, you know, decided this is who he is. With no discernible talent. He's not even vaguely attractive, and he's actually really obnoxious and not good fun down the pub. No, you know, like
is it a fair assessment then to say that I think, you know, if I'd never heard of this case, I think the Netflix one obviously is 3 hours long, so it's 2 hours shorter. It's 3 episodes, 2 hours shorter than Jim Sheridan's one. The Netflix one is a good introduction into the case. It definitely skirts over a lot of stuff. It misses out on a lot of stuff. But, you know, there is obviously stuff in it that, you know, the Jim Sheridan one omits and vice versa. But I think it's a good beginner's guide to the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier. And then by contrast, Jim Sheridan's one is probably more geared towards the Irish and UK and French audience that would be familiar with this story. And then B, it's trying to give additional information that audience who's already grown up with the case may not have heard of before. Is that a fair statement? I think
that's entirely fair. And I think that is also, it also reflects kind of the various sources and access that both had. So the Netflix documentary worked primarily with Sophie's family.
Yes.
Sophie's family wouldn't work with a team that was also working with Ian Bailey.
Which is understandable.
Which, you know, it's their call. They're the people in charge. So there's, you know, there's a lot of you know, the suspect that you don't get to see in the Netflix documentary. And, you know, on the flip side, there's a lot of Sophie that you don't get to see in the Jim Sheridan documentary. Not that it's lacking in representing who Sophie was. I think it does a reasonably good job at that, but it's kind of more of a musing on the case than
a deep dive
than a deep dive. Yeah. So if
yeah.
you want information, you need to go to Netflix.
Yeah.
If you want a kind of pondering over the tragedy of it all, then you watch Jim Sheridan. But then you need to watch Netflix again to remind yourself
100%.
that as much as you like the Jim Sheridan documentary, there's information missing from it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you have to refresh your brain.
At the moment, the Netflix one stands at 7.4 on IMDb, and it actually is 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is relatively unheard of. Jim Sheridan's one then is standing at 7.1. So slightly below the Netflix version on IMDb, and there's currently no rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a reflection of the Netflix one being better than Jim's one. It's probably just in terms of distribution, like it's just had a wider audience.
Yeah.
And we are only 11 days and 8 days out, respectively, from the two of them. So, I mean, there probably really hasn't been enough time, for the public to view it and to get a full whack of the public feeling on both. And as you said and I said, and I think 100%, there's merit in both. There's answers for certain things and certain ones. Definitely the Netflix one, watch it first, then watch the Jim Sheridan one, and then just to,
watch the Netflix one again.
Because look, there's no point beating around the bush, and it has had a bit of backlash. Jim Sheridan's one definitely goes easier on Ian Bailey, but as you said in the production meeting, and you're bang on the money there, like he had access to this contributor. You have to fucking keep them sweet as well, because that's how you keep them in the production.
Yeah. Like Ian Bailey is trying to currently he had done an interview with the Netflix production team. He had done kind of a brief teaser interview with them, and he's currently trying to pull that from the Netflix documentary. He said he says he hasn't watched the Netflix documentary yet.
Which
I'm not sure I
Go
believe.
Shite. Such a narcissist. Yes, he has.
But I could well believe that, there was a bit of pussyfooting around Ian Bailey in order to just keep him on board.
Of course.
And, he is not in Ireland, he is not a convicted man. So, we have to kind of,
and we have some of the harshest libel laws. This is the reason non-nationals come over here and instigate libel cases, because we have some of the harshest punishments for them over here. So you have to be careful, which is why I keep saying we are neither saying that he did it or didn't do it. We don't know. We're just reviewing the documentaries and giving our 2 cents worth. But yeah, it's fascinating viewing on both ends. I didn't think there was anything else I could find out about this case.
Oh, you should have spent your weekend with me, because I went down a rabbit hole.
Tell me.
There's still, there were things that I still wanted answers for that neither of the documentaries gave me. I wanted timelines. I wanted who made statements what, when, to whom. I wanted whether something was in a Garda questionnaire or was it in a written statement. I went so far as to Google the Freedom of Information Act in France to see if it was possible to get access to the French court files.
Sinead, I'm going to get you on for every episode from now on.
Well,
I'll give you a list of unanswered questions and documentaries. Go nuts.
It turned out that I didn't need to, because actually alongside the crew from Jim Sheridan's documentary, there was an author that was there as well. His name is Nick Foster. Okay. And he released a book in May of this year called Murder at Roaring Water Bay. And it's about the case. He was the man that you see in Jim Sheridan's documentary, speaking to Ian Bailey, giving the updates on what has happened in the court, the English guy.
Oh, the guy ringing him from France.
Yeah, Nick.
Stop. Okay.
So he was given access to a huge portion of what Ian Bailey had access to on a stick. And there's a number of witness statements that are kind of copied out verbatim, and you get a better idea of who said what and when. And there are things like something that was brought up in the French case was that Jules's initial statement to Gardaí was far more wobbly than you are led to believe in general. That her initial statement was very much, I don't really know where he was. I don't know if he could have done this. I wasn't with him all of the night. It's very much unsure of what was going on. And she says that all of this, she now says all of this is complete hogwash, and that the statement that she gave to Gardaí was nothing like what they have written down, and it's all Garda corruption and things like that. And Garda corruption does happen. It absolutely
of course
does.
Of course it does.
It just there's stuff in there. She and Ian Bailey both deny that they left the house on the morning of the 23rd before they went to visit the crime scene. However, one of Jules's daughters said that Jules did in fact leave the house at some point, and she came back, and that it kind of goes into the witnesses who saw Jules in Skull, and what he was up to on the 21st, the day before. And then there's also a mysterious man that I had completely discounted before. I had come across in research before, but there was a sighting of Sophie while she was driving from Cork Airport to her home in Skull, when she stopped in Skibbereen to get petrol in her car. And the man that served her, he actually pumped the petrol for her, which is something I hadn't realized before. I kind of thought maybe it was somebody like in the shop who'd seen somebody he thought was Sophie. But this man describes pumping the petrol for her and there being a man in the car with her. And at the car seat, the passenger seat was pushed all the way back. That's how it was found the next day. So somebody, a quite tall man, he was wearing a hat and a dark coat and had a bit of a beard. The petrol attendant, he's actually a garage owner. Like
these murderers, they never wear like brightly colored anoraks, do them? It's always
can
like
they not wear an orange anorak, please? Yeah.
I'm off to commit a murder. Like, yeah, it's
stop me if you can.
It's so infuriating. It's so infuriating. How lucky does a person have to be to get away with this? Like,
he has a specific memory of this woman because she was French as well. Yeah. Not something that you see every day.
No, so, but it stuck out like sore thumb.
And she didn't understand what he'd said to her at first, because he'd asked, what, is it petrol you're wanting or something like that. And she didn't understand. So the man in the car had repeated the question for her
in poetic prose. No, I'm only joking.
The dolphins
recited a poem about dolphins. So look, the murder murder I should say at the cottage, and Sophie, a murder in West Cork. Would you recommend them, Sinead?
Yes, both together at the same time, one after the other.
Yes,
multiple times
ad nauseum.
Definitely, yeah, definitely.
For 10 days on repeat, keep watching them.
Yeah, no, they're both really good.
They're both really
good.
They are. And
hopefully, Sky Crime will release Jim Sheridan's doc wider, because I think it's a really nice documentary. It's just really nicely done. It's a bit more artistic than the Netflix one. So I hope other people get to see that one as well. But they're both very good.
Yeah. No. They're both have their merits definitely in the story of
the
Sophie.
Story is so compelling. That's what it is, like the story is so compelling. So
Sinead from Mens Rea. Guys, if you haven't already, I'm sure you have, make sure to give her a follow, a subscribe, a like, a download. What else can they do? Patreon, reviews, the whole shebang. Sinead, you're an absolute star. Thanks a million for doing this. That's all we've got time for this week, guys. It was a belter. I enjoy that so much. If you like what we do here at What's Up Doc Podcast, remember the easiest way to show your support and the easiest way to support any podcaster out there is to head on over to Apple Podcasts, give us a rating and give us a review and subscribe as well, because you'll be notified then when all of the new episodes are released. It's been a blast as always. Guys, until next time, good luck, good night, God bless.
The only thing better than grinding all night for your side hustle is your roommate picking you up with Mickey D's breakfast. The perfect pickup deal.
There's a deal for every morning at McDonald's.
Right now, taste breakfast perfection when you get a warm and savory sausage McMuffin with egg for just $2.50. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with combo meal.
If you love to be remembered as the person who gives the best birthday gifts, I'm here to tell you that 1-800-Flowers.com is your ultimate birthday gifting destination. 1-800-Flowers has thoughtful and artfully created options that are guaranteed to deliver the best birthday surprise. Shop thousands of unique gifts at 1-800-Flowers.com for exclusive offers and great values. To order today, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/tune in. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/tune in.